Welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Ed Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hello, hello, hello.
Hey there.
Good evening. We are discussing Bad Adaptation today, our series on good books made into bad films. For the series, we read The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt, High Rise by J.G. Ballard, and As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. If you're listening to us for the first time, you can join our book club discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod. That link is in the episode description. We are also on social media at Canonical Pod, all one word. And if you would like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link. That link is also in the episode description.
So, in this series, we've looked at 3 novels and the way that their film adaptations have failed in some way to present their stories in an interesting or compelling way. And I think that looking at failures is interesting. I think we can learn more about adaptation if we compare adaptations that fail to their opposite. A film adaptation that not only captures some of the magic of the source, but even improves on it. I found that in an article, a review on LitHub by Ryan Chapman, and it's a review of a new film, Drive My Car, by director Ryusuke Hamaguchi. It's an adaptation of Haruki Murakami's short story of the same name, published in his collection Men Without Women. And in the title, the headline of his review, Chapman makes a bold claim. He says that this new film surpasses the source material. The 3 of us read the story and we watched the film, but as an experiment, what we did is we reversed the normal order. We watched the film first because in the previous 3 adaptations we looked at, we always kind of wondered if the films were meant to stand alone as works of art or if they were meant to be companions to the original text. And when you read the text first, it always influences the way that you judge the film. So we watched the film first, and then we read the story later on. And for me, it was definitely an interesting way to look at an adaptation. So the basic story in both the film and the story revolve around Ryusuke Hamaguchi, who is a middle-aged actor, and he is grieving the loss of his beloved wife, Oto. Even though their relationship was very close, they had a good relationship, Ryusuke was privately aware that Ota slept with other men. And he continues to be troubled by that, as you can imagine he would be, even after her death. Now, as Kafka later on is preparing for a production of Chekhov's Uncle Vanya, he forms a complex relationship with his young female driver and also has a quite difficult encounter with one of the men that his wife slept with. So Chapman says that this film far surpasses the original material, and I actually think I agree with him. How did you guys feel?
Yes, and not particularly
Yeah.
close.
I agree. Yeah, I thought the story was okay, but a pretty pale comparison.
When you read the story afterwards, did you feel like something was being filled in? Or did you feel like because you had seen so much new content in the film that something was missing when you read the story?
The film isn't an exact replica or adaptation of the story. It also borrows from another short story from that collection. It adds new details. So I would say neither. It really does stand separate from the short story. It embellishes and fleshes out aspects of the short story that I think are very interesting. And it just is kind of its own product, its own work of art.
I'm sorry, I just saw in your notes that you wrote Sob Story would have been a much better story title.
Yeah, it would have been a way better title. Sob Story. Drive My Car is a terrible title. This story is one of Murakami's lesser works. Like, after reading it, I thought the story was just fine. I was really surprised that someone decided to adapt this story.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. So the only reason I can see that he would choose this is because he could expand on it. He saw seeds here and decided, well, this is okay, but I can make this my own and make it much better.
In a lot of Murakami, there's a metaphysical or supernatural element, and that is difficult to put on screen, especially if you don't have a big budget for effects and CGI. This is more straightforward, it's character driven. You can tell this story on a limited budget, and I think that's part of the reason why it was chosen. I wasn't let down by the story. I think the story was good enough. I don't think every story has to be amazing. I don't feel like it was a bad story, but it's just not something amazing.
Right. But even compared to other Murakami, like James was saying, and I like Murakami, but if this was my foray into Murakami, I don't know that I would want to read more. Like, it's not bad, but it's not great either.
Yeah, in terms of its ability as a short story to stand on its own, like if you're removing it from the name Murakami and you just came across it in a slush pile, like it's not great. Like it's okay.
It's interesting how much Hamaguchi was able to pull from this and tease out the Chekhov play Uncle Vanya. In the story, it doesn't do anything. I read Uncle Vanya in college and I barely remember it, but there are a couple little things in the story that if you know some of Uncle Vanya, you can piece together on your own. Like Sonia's character feels the opposite that Kafuku feels about wanting to know truth. Sonia in the play doesn't want to learn the truth of whether someone is in love with her. She'd rather the mystery exist. The reason I bring this up is just Murakami drops these seeds, but doesn't do anything with them. But in the movie, Uncle Vanya really ties well together thematically.
I think that we can put a little bit of the blame on Murakami, or we can say that this is undeveloped, but I could also say that it's easier to access certain content in film. When you have the voices embodied, it's easier to see the relationship between the texts. In the story, it's more difficult. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's Murakami's fault. It could be my fault.
Maybe, but what I mean is that it's a name drop for Murakami, as so many things are with Murakami.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's pretty typical Murakami where you might say, if you're charitable, that he's living in that high context society where just by saying Uncle Vanya, you know exactly what he means by using Uncle Vanya. But in the story, he also uses like what CCR. He drops CCR. I forget what the other bands were in that list. Murakami does that all the time, right? He just drops in some kind of cultural touchstone and expects you to understand. In the film, what I really enjoyed is in the scenes where he is driving, he plays the cassette, and as he drives, the dialogue from Uncle Vanya has some kind of resonance with what's going on with him internally. That's what makes the film really great for me. And that's a way of using Uncle Vanya, like he had said, where in a film you can do that, but in a story you could drop in a line, like almost have it as a excerpt, but it's kind of awkward.
I expected a lot more of what happened in the movie to actually be in the story. So I was surprised when we only get really one scene between Kafuku and Watari. It's split up in two different pieces, but it's really just one scene.
In the film, I thought that it was more developed and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't always believable. They do come from very different worlds and they're very reluctant to open up to each other. But, not to reveal too much of what happens, they do decide near the end of the movie to do something very big together. And that to me felt a little bit false. I was with it because I was willing to suspend disbelief, but it didn't seem real. On the other hand, there's a parallel relationship between Kafuku and the man who slept with his dead wife, which is much more developed. And the difference between the kind of central relationship that we'd get or we would expect from the title, and this other relationship felt kind of awkward to me. In the story, it was even more awkward, but in the film, I would like to have seen more of the connection between Kafuku and Watari. Like, I didn't feel that was developed enough. I thought it was interesting because it was very oblique. We couldn't really understand how they saw each other, and that's interesting on its own, but if their relationship had been developed even more, it could have been even more interesting.
I was okay with it in the movie. I get what you're saying about some parts of it not being believable. I was able to suspend that disbelief. Story, it just didn't feel important to me. In the movie, Watari feels like a character to me. In the story, she felt like a wall for Kafuku to bounce ideas against.
Yeah, I had a similar reading of both, or viewing, I guess. And I just want to clarify that Watari is the driver, because I don't think we mentioned that.
With large breasts, Murakami wants us to know.
Well, larger than average, at least.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, I thought that the relationship in the film was vague. I didn't think it was too underdeveloped, but it was, for me, just developed enough, like her breasts. In the story, though, I didn't think this was a strong story. I don't think Watari as a character in the story really worked that well, because the story was trying to go for some kind of connection with her as his daughter, and I just didn't feel it from the story.
In general, I ended up liking the story less than the movie. And I think the reason why is because the movie develops themes. And to me, I think that's something distinct from what we might call filling in gaps. There weren't gaps in the story. Everything kind of had a place, and everything was developed to the point where you could understand what was happening on a mechanical level. It wasn't enigmatic. But I think what Hamaguchi did really well is he saw what could be expanded even further. What he adds to the story, I think, is of a piece with what Murakami included. So it doesn't feel tacked on at all. So it develops more without adding anything unnecessary or adding something that was missing from the story.
So let's talk about our series as a whole then. For quite a few of our books and movies, we said that a television series would have been better than a film because of the length that a series allows for. Do you think then that short stories are better choices than novels for film adaptations? Because what we saw here with Drive My Car was based on a short story, and it allowed the director and the screenwriter to expand upon it rather than to reduce it. So are short stories better choices than novels for film adaptations?
I would say so. When people look at a novel and they say, okay, I'm going to adapt this, they typically underestimate the amount of material they have. Like they think, okay, I'm going to get this guy doing this and then that, and then the ending, and I'm done. And so much of the experience that you have with the novel, because it's drawn out over several hours or even several days, it builds up its mood and its atmosphere in a very different way. And that's the type of content that invariably gets cut out of the adaptation.
I think it largely depends on how complex the novel is. A short story, a very good short story, really should only strike one note. It really should be built around some central idea or theme. And when you have that, it makes adaptation very easy because you don't have to try to pick between 3 or 4 conflicting ideas, like what happened with The Goldfinch, where the adaptation just couldn't land on some concrete way of reinterpreting an 800-page book. With something that's only 30 pages, 40 pages long, with one clear emotional note or idea, you don't have to pick and choose. You know what's there, and you kind of tease it out and reimagine it. So in that way, I think it's just easier to adapt a short story.
I agree with what you're saying, but then if you're saying it's easier to do a short story than to do a full novel, does that mean that we shouldn't be doing novels, or does that mean that we have to be more selective in the novels that we choose in some way?
I think the latter. I don't know if we should or shouldn't, because we've had discussions in the past about how some novels are better suited for other media, yet you believed that A Confederacy of Dunces should have been either a stage play or something on the screen. What are these intrinsic qualities of text that can't be adapted into film and vice versa? So, yeah, you mentioned one is like slapstick comedy. Like that should be obviously viewed.
Anything that relies on the body. I mean, if you see a body doing something in front of you, it's going to get you interested in a way that a description of a body will never do. Like, that's the reason why Playboy has pictures, right?
Well, I read it for the articles. And plus, the magazine's gone now. So, where am I going to get my articles?
Well, what happened to, what was it, the Penthouse letters to the editor or
Oh,
whatever, where people made these really specious claims about things that definitely happened to them?
yeah. I mean, that's a different kind of horny, I guess. Like, when you read those letters, you can get off on it, but it's a different thing. And I think that that difference is fine. We don't need to treat them like they belong to the same category. So I think that that's something that film can offer. Spectacles, eroticism, that's better done on stage or on screen. I think in a novel, this is something that I mentioned when we're talking about High Rise. You can't really get a good shot on film of somebody thinking about something. It doesn't work. You also can't really get interiority. You can't inhabit the world through a person's point of view on film the same way you can in a novel. That just is impossible because the camera is always the third person in the world.
Yeah, I agree with you, though I will say that in Drive My Car, one of the strongest parts of the film for me was the way the director or the cinematographer showed you the interior life of Yosuke. There were a lot of shots that showed him at a distance from other characters, and you really feel his loneliness. Like there was one I remember where it was after his driver took him to, was it like a trash processing facility or something?
Mm-hmm.
And they're near the ocean, and you see an overhead shot of him like 3/4 down the steps, and she is sitting at the top of the steps, and you can just see like the distance between them. The film does it all the time. Even with the car is not parked next to a car. There are like empty spaces around the car. There's another car far away, and there's another car like behind him. Through these images, you get a sense that he is very alone.
It can definitely be done, yeah, but it's always metaphoric, right? Like you can't do it literally.
Yes, it's done in a different way, but that's the adaptation, right? Like that's in my mind what makes an adaptation good is that you have to translate that kind of interiority to some kind of visual medium.
Right.
All right, let's pause for a break. We'll be back in a bit.
Here, I think it's worthwhile to step maybe even further back to talk more about the theory of adaptation. In a general sense, I think it can help us to evaluate what is and isn't possible when we try to do this, or when we look at adaptations and decide if we think they're good or not. When we judge them intuitively, it seems that we judge the success of an adaptation separately from the way we judge the adaptation as an individual work of art. It also seems intuitive, to me at least, that a work can be a good work of art, but a bad adaptation. But can a work be a good adaptation, but also a bad work of art? In other words, is the process of making an adaptation, or is the process of adaptation itself, an art-making process?
An adaptation should stand on its own, and thus I think it is an art-making process. So your previous question, can a work be a good adaptation but a bad work of art? Absolutely. I think so.
In our The Impossibility of a New Home series, we reviewed Julia Otsuka's The Buddha in the Attic. And we came across, or we expressed this school of thought where a work is successful when it does what its author intended to do with it. And I can accept that point of view. I think that that's one of the ways that a book can be successful. I think that the same thing can be said of films and their directors. If a director does what he wants to do, it's a success in some way. So if a director merely intends to adapt something and doesn't intend to add anything to it, but wants to capture what he finds in a text faithfully as possible, and then put that on the screen, is that, specifically that, an art-making process? I would say yes, only because I think about it as a process of observation and a process of expression. So if we had an author looking at a love affair or thinking of a love affair, observing it, and then reporting the interesting features to a reader, we would definitely say that's art. But if we had an adapter making a film, observing a text, and then reporting its main features in a very straightforward, faithful way, is that art?
I think it's similar to the work of a translator. It's not the same because you're working across mediums, but a translator has to make certain decisions when translating.
Yes, but with a translation, while you have to make decisions, you're still trying to stay faithful to the original work, whereas an adaptation, I don't think you necessarily need to stay faithful to it.
Yeah, but I'm continuing this thought experiment of a good adaptation and a bad work of art. The way I'm understanding this is adaptation a creative art making process? For me, it's like translation. Translation isn't just getting a dictionary and switching one word for another.
Sure.
So you have to make choices. Because you have to make choices, then you are creating something. So it's an art making process.
I think the reason why I'm asking this question is because when we imagine somebody making an adaptation in that way, where they try to be as faithful as possible and they limit themselves, most of us, I think, would be like Sam, where we would say, well, that's not enough. You should do more. I think as consumers, we hope that people adapting things will do more than just kind of translate it word for word, like a bad translator. But can we really fault them when they don't? For me, I think the answer is that we do fault them because fidelity is not enough. I think that this is the proof that fidelity is not enough and that there must be some other factor involved in the process of adaptation. What it is a little bit unclear.
I don't think it's necessarily unclear. I think it depends on the project. It depends on the source material, but it also depends on the medium of the adaptation. So we can get specific here. Since we're talking about text to film, a visual medium, I think it's important for the director or the people involved in making the film to capitalize and exploit what makes film great. So, for example, Lord of the Rings was great in part because it shows us this beautiful, fantastical world. You know, if it just had these long, boring explanations and and history lessons, it wouldn't be as interesting. If it had these long poems and songs, we would have The Hobbit, which was not nearly as good.
So then if we go back to the initial idea that we can judge the adaptation separately from judging the work as a work of art, then there are factors that are separate from fidelity that we judge when we judge whether or not something is a good adaptation. But are those factors different from the factors that contribute to the success of a work as a work of art? And you're talking here about choosing the elements that make film wonderful. So what are the factors that make an adaptation good, besides fidelity, that are different from the factors that make a work of art good? So I'll share my examples because I have two factors that I think maybe we could call them abilities instead of factors that we judge, or at least that I judge when I decide whether it's a good adaptation. You could call them the metal detector or the fuel gauge. These are kind of cute names I've come up with. So it's a metal detector because a creator wants the work to have a sense of completion, a finality, but the adapter has to use the metal detector to search for buried treasure inside of the original source work. And the original creator is trying to hide it. When Murakami wrote Drive My Car, he didn't want you to have the feeling that there could have been more, because that would make you feel like it's not a good story, right? So the specific adapter skill that Hamaguchi has is to find the content that he did add to the film, even though Murakami is trying very desperately to make it seem like nothing needed to be added. The fuel gauge, I think, is a similar sort of thing. It may be even the same thing. I think the fuel gauge is a way of looking at a source, and he has to know when he's run out of interest, or when the interest available in the source material has been expended. It's difficult sometimes to know when you're looking at something if something could really be added to it. And I think that this is a distinct skill that adapters have that art makers don't necessarily have, because when art makers make art, they're often looking at nature or human relationships. They're not looking at other works of art.
So it's kind of like an editor in a certain way. You're looking for qualities you want to enhance or bring to the forefront.
I think that's true. What I would say is that in Drive My Car specifically, we see this, I think, because so much of the film takes root in the story, but it becomes something new. And I think that what this shows me, at least, is that a good adaptation is usually a process of addition rather than subtraction. My heuristic here, my guess is that if you're starting with subtraction, you're probably making a bad adaptation. And I think the greater challenge, or perhaps the greatest challenge for somebody making an adaptation, is to add something that's new to the new work, but feels of a piece with the existing work. It has to have a tonal match with the existing work. So in the film Drive My Car, there are three things that I think Hamaguchi has added. The wife's stories, even though that does come from another part of the short story collection, he chose to add it to this story or to this film. And they go on a trip to Hokkaido. And also in the story, it's not the wife's voice on the tape that he listens to in his car, but in the film it is. So these are three things that he added to the story in the film adaptation, and they all work, but more importantly, these are all things that I think Murakami himself would have done.
You're kind of going against your own point by saying what Murakami would have done.
Well, let me say it this way. You have to be a great artist, but you have to be a great artist in a disguise. When you adapt Murakami, you have to be a great artist in the way that Murakami is a great artist. And then when you adapt Donna Tartt, you have to be a great artist in the way that Donna Tartt is a great artist. So if you make adaptations, you not only have to create, but you have to create things that are integral or could be integral with the things that have already been created in the source.
I guess so. I think you're right, certainly about going back just slightly when you said that it's probably a better idea to be additive than subtractive. But I think you could argue that all three of the books we saw, maybe not the Goldfinch was more subtraction, but the other two, while there were subtractions that had to happen, they also added things
Yes.
that I would argue none of those additions were good additions.
Yeah. I'm not saying this is a guarantee for success, by the way. I'm just saying that in general, this is a better way to move forward. So if we then believe that, for whatever reason, the adapted work has to deviate from the source, when it deviates, how do we judge whether or not that deviance is successful? Because sometimes it's a process of adding something new, and sometimes it's more mechanical. Something doesn't work with something else, or something doesn't work with the production schedule of a film, and some details have to be tweaked. As an example, in Drive My Car, one of the things that gets changed is in the story, Watari's mother dies in a car crash, and in the film, Watari's mother dies in a landslide. So these two things were exchanged because in the film, the landslide accommodates other things that the director wants to do. When these changes are made and we judge them to be successful, I think the reason why we judge them to be successful is a kind of structuralist way of looking at texts. We say, this new thing is structurally equivalent to the old thing, so I can swap it out and it's not going to make a big difference, right? But does this type of thinking about adaptation, this way of judging their success, require us to believe in structuralism in general?
Well, can we expand on this example? In the film, the way her mother dies echoes the feeling of guilt that is present in the film. It's not present in the story. In the story, the way her mother dies echoes the parent-child relationship, because Yosuke had his license revoked because he was drunk driving, and her mother dies because she was drunk driving. So there's this parent-child echo. But the two are not the same, I'd argue. They both die, but the reason why they die differs, and they enhance different ideas in their respective works. How would you view that as a structuralist argument? Because to me, it's quite different, besides the fact that they die, but they don't even die the same way.
I think that the structuralist claim is that there is an underlying way that elements of a text relate to other elements of a text. And I don't think the claim is that in every case where things are swapped, that it's a perfect swap. But I think that the claim is that in the world, if you had an unlimited amount of time to consider, you would eventually be able to find the perfect swap, that there is some sort of formal characteristic that could be reproduced and replaced. And I think that that's a claim to the way stories work that is perhaps used in adaptations, but I'm not so sure when we evaluate an adaptation if we are making the same claim when we say this is a good swap for that. In the film, I do agree with you that it does have a different resonance. It does have a different way of connecting to the rest of the story. So it's not completely identical. It's not structurally the same, but it is partially the same. Is it possible to find anything that would be completely the same?
I don't have an answer for that, but I just want to comment that the partially the same, in my mind, is what makes it a good adaptation. Because of the fact that in the film it heightens the guilt that the main character is feeling, that allows the film to work and to have its interior tension. That's very important. To your prior question of what makes an adaptation good, that's what makes an adaptation good, is the adapter is making a choice to move away from one kind of resonance for another. Just the phrase, structural equivalence, I mean, it's very abstract, right? But would that even be structurally equivalent? Like, sure, in both stories, someone dies, but they die differently and they have different resonant effects. Like, is that structurally equivalent?
I think if you're looking at it as a formula, it does sort of make sense in that way, because Death A in the short story has a resonance of A prime, if we want to get pseudo-mathematical. That same thing happens in the movie. It's a different theme. Like you point out, it's not this parent-daughter relationship anymore, but now we have this guilt complex. But it's still structurally equivalent in that it's two people moving in the same direction.
I mean, I see them moving in the same direction in that it makes them closer, but the relationship is so different that it's difficult for me to say. I mean, if you just say, okay, a death leads to two people becoming closer, then yes. Like, if we just really reduce it to that, I can see it.
Well, yeah, but okay. What I mean is the deaths in the story have some sort of thematic equivalence, right? In the same way that the deaths in the movie have some sort of thematic equivalence. That's all. There's resonance between the characters. It's not that two different characters die and that's why they are pulled together. It's that two different characters die in sort of similar ways.
I think the reason why this question is significant to me is because a lot of other people are invested in kind of this idea of story archetypes, like the hero's journey, and the fact that you can look at a bunch of different stories and reduce them in some way to an archetype, one of several archetypes. And what I'm trying to argue against, perhaps, is to say perhaps that reduction is not really a valid process. When you reduce too much. And I think here I take what James is saying and I would expand on it by saying that when we look at the world that we experience and when we look at the stories that we read, they vary in infinite complexity. There is no way to take something in one story and replace it with something of identical resonance in an adaptation. It's impossible to do. And it's impossible to do because everything in a work of art is connected to everything else in an organic unity. You couldn't cut off my arm and replace it with James's arm and have me still be me.
I'll say it in a different way, and I don't know if it's exactly what Iad's saying, but we take it for granted, and I think it's true, that each work has its interior logic, right, and its own interior resonance. It's impossible to perfectly mimic that resonance when you're adapting. This is my argument in The Goldfinch, that I thought the director was trying to mimic all these different things in the book, but really what they needed to do was just to pick one or two ideas that are really important and build the film around that idea. Because it's a fool's errand to completely mimic the interior logic of something else. So in this film, if you wanted to sort of draw lines and draw relationships, in the film, the main character losing his wife is equivalent to his driver losing her mom, because it creates this feeling of guilt. That's that kind of shape or relationship. That's not the shape in the story. The story is the main character loses his wife. That is different from how the driver loses her mother. It doesn't have that parallel resonance.
Right. But the further step is like, even if you found a way to capture that further resonance, there would be even further aspects that you could never replace. So when we talk about art and we talk about stories as if there were archetypes, I guess my point here is that there are no real archetypes. And, functionally, we can operate as if there were, but in truth, I would say there aren't. And whether or not that matters to you, I think depends on how much you care about understanding stories. And I think that for a lot of people, it's not important, but, perhaps for some of us, it is.
I guess I'm still a little confused because even though the swaps aren't,
Yeah, somehow EAD's made you into a structuralist. Like, you came into this conversation saying, what the hell is this? And now you're an ardent defender of
a little
structuralism.
bit, because I feel like in some ways you could argue that Hamaguchi did say, okay, this is how it works in the story, but in order for it to work in the movie, I have to do these different things. They still have their own internal logic. Yes, they're different, but by swapping X for Y, he still has to make Y work in a certain special way, not in the exact same way that X did in the story, but it still has to have some sort of weight. Even if he made changes to that weight, it still has to have weight. He changed the details, which changes the theme, but the structure itself remains intact.
I would say that what you're arguing against is perhaps the way you look at what I'm saying is the opposite of structure is complete openness. And I don't think that it is completely open. Like, I do think that there are principles where we say, this is a good sub for that, and this is a bad sub for that. But how exactly that works is ill-defined. That's what I'm trying to get
Right.
at.
Okay, that's fair.
Yet this conclusion, the conclusion that you've arrived at is that there are no archetypes. And I don't completely agree, even though I do agree with you on almost everything you've said. I think there is a middle ground between no archetypes at all and everything is an archetype. Because we are wired in certain ways that make us people. There are some structures in some stories that will resonate for us. Stories are told in certain ways that become popular, which is what the archetype is. But I don't think it's as simple as you just swap it in and out, because there are so many details involved, and the details are what matters in stories. If the story is reduced to something as simple as, oh, I don't know, son kills father, son marries mother. Like, if that is it, that is not a very compelling story because it lacks all the details that make it work.
Are you guys ready for a half-formed thought? Here's my half-formed thought. You remember when we were talking in the episode about Galapagos, and we're talking about the division of animals into different species and how that division was just a human contrivance. It's just something meant for convenience's sake. That's the way I look at it when I look at people talking about story archetypes, is that it doesn't exist in the story, but it exists for a way of talking about stories. The difficulty, though, is that animals are part of a physical, natural world. They have a material presence, and stories are not. So how can there be something in a story that humans are not grasping, or that humans are grafting other content onto? Because isn't everything inside of a story and the way we understand a story social?
I have a kind of a example or explanation, and this is also a half-formed thought, but I will also freely admit that most of what we do here are half-formed thoughts, so this is not out of the ordinary for us, I think. I think that it's biological, just like how humans are wired to suckle for milk when they're born. There's certain things in our biology, in our neurology, that predispose us to think or react in certain ways. So certain actions create an emotional effect in what we would consider to be normal people, right? That's how you build an archetype, is when certain actions create certain emotional effects, then that's the seed of an archetype. Like, for example, the murder of a mother. It elicits a certain emotion from you.
Yeah, I don't deny that, but I just think that that's still something apart from the content that they're reacting to. That's them.
Yeah. I'm not saying my half-formed thought is superior to yours, but maybe the two of them can just kind of glom onto each other somehow and twirl away. All right, this concludes our Bad Adaptations series. Thank you for listening. Next week, we will come back with a new series on contemporary utopias. We will be reading and reviewing Paradise by Toni Morrison. If you'd like to see our reading schedule, that's on Reddit at Canonical Pod. We also post threads for discussion every Friday. If you'd like to talk about the books we discussed today or other good or bad film adaptations, you can find us there. We'd love to hear from you. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, go ahead and give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. That really helps us grow the community. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.